Hello and welcome to our session today. We're very lucky to be joined by two data scientists to discuss what I think a lot of us feel is, in admittedly rather gloomy times, a moment of optimism, a interesting executive order that was launched early in the Biden administration, day one, and that is going to result in or be part of a measurement revolution and hopefully result in a more equitable United States and a role model for other countries. Let me just first introduce our colleagues, Jay Davis and Meredith Brown. Jay Davis is a data scientist and engineer currently serving as a Presidential Innovation Fellow at the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he focuses on equity. At DOT, he's heading up an effort to build tools that will make the agency's data more easily accessible and better operationalized for equity-related analysis and applications. As a part of this effort, he's working to implement the recommendations of the Equitable Data Working Group at DOT, and he also serves on the Interagency Working Group on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity data, and he's researching and writing about privacy enhancing technologies, including their impact and effectiveness for more vulnerable populations. Meredith Brown is a U.S. Digital Core Data Science Fellow, part of the first cohort of these digital fellows, currently staffing the White House Office of Science and Technology, or OSTP, where she focuses on the equitable implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. At OSTP, she coordinates data efforts between the White House Infrastructure Implementation Team, agencies, and stakeholders to ensure government works for all Americans. And again, the U.S. Digital Core is a new program started by the Biden administration to encourage early career technologists to join the federal government. So for all you CMU folks who are thinking of pathways into the federal government, this is one. And we're going to go to questions about all of this in a few minutes. So be thinking about what your questions are. So Jay and Meredith, tell us a little bit more about what you do, but also why you do it. Should we start with Meredith and then go to Jay?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me today. It's really exciting to be here. I think coming out of school, I was really excited to work on issues that were important to everybody, and wanting to use the data science skills that I had to actually make an impact. And I think one of the best ways to make an impact is to infuse our policy with an equity lens and to use the data that we have to serve all Americans. And so when I was looking for ways to join the government, I came across the U.S. Digital Core program, and it's an honor to be a fellow. And so I work at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, specifically on the data analytics team. And we are working to provide equity support for the implementation of the Biden administration's policy goals. So right now, that's primarily the bipartisan infrastructure law, but we're starting to shift and prepare for implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a really exciting prospect. So it's a lot about coordinating with agencies and making sure that they're targeting the right groups of Americans for access to these grants, to this funding, to make sure that everyone qualifies and everyone is able to apply for these things, and to actually make sure that our outreach is targeted to the communities that need it most. So I'll pass it over to Jay.
Thank you, Meredith. Lovely to be here with you. And Sarah, thanks for the lovely introduction. Goodness, how did I become a PIF and why do I do this? So I've done a little bit of government work before, and I've done a little for-profit work before, but most of my background is nonprofit. And I've always just been really passionate about having a career that was focused on serving people and serving the greater good. I'm also very passionate about equity in technology and have worked on equity issues for several years in several different jobs. Was really excited to learn about the opportunity to become a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and then was beyond excited to find out that there was a project that was focused just on equity, because this project is everything that I really care about and want to be digging into right now. For anyone who's thinking about jobs where you want to have a really big, broad impact and work on really complicated but interesting problems, I got to recommend civic tech to you. I think it's the best place to be, and I think it's an incredible place to be right now in particular.
Civic tech meaning what exactly?
So civic tech meaning jobs with the federal government or jobs with state or local governments working on technology that is deployed by government for the purpose of providing services, administering programs, doing all the things government does. And I would also add there's a number of nonprofits doing really interesting work around the civic tech space and a number of academics and researchers as well. So people who are observing, adding code, adding ideas, those spaces are great places to be too.
We tend to talk about public interest technologist at CMU. So, but I like the civic tech label, makes a lot of sense to me. Both of what you have discussed raise questions, but I'm gonna go first to just to get everybody on the same page. The executive order. So President Biden on day one of the administration signed the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And here I'm going to quote from the report that came out this spring. The EO, quote, launched a whole of government effort to incorporate the principle of equity through the federal government, recognizing that the ability to conduct equity assessments, i.e. to understand the impact of federal policy on equity outcomes and identify and remove barriers to equitable access to government programs, is contingent on gathering the necessary data. President Biden ordered the formation of the Equitable Data Working Group. The president directed the working group to study existing federal data collection policies, programs, and infrastructure to identify inadequacies and provide recommendations that lay out a strategy for increasing data available for measuring equity and representing the diversity of the American people. Disaggregated data, data that can be broken down and analyzed by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, veteran status, age, or other key demographic variables is essential to this task. So let's talk about why this is important. I touted the need for disaggregated data recently in congressional testimony, but I'd love to hear from you both on this issue. I think it's absolutely fundamental. What do you guys think? Let's start with you, Jay, and then go to Meredith.
Sure. So when it comes to DOT, there are two major ways that we think about equity impacts. One of which is thinking about who is underserved, i.e. who doesn't have access to the transportation that they need. And then number two, who's overburdened? So who's dealing disproportionately with negative impacts of transportation? So that includes things like air pollution or noise or safety issues. When we think about transportation too, a lot of us think of it as being really highly localized. So again, air pollution and noise being good examples of how transportation has a local impact. Or think about that last little bit of distance that you have to cover when you take the train home and that train stop doesn't go quite to where you live. Or think about travel time and how long it takes to get somewhere if you don't live really close to a faster moving road or to a public transit stop. So one thing that's a challenge for DOT with disaggregation is that a lot of our public data is at the county level. So when we administer grants, we're always considering who those grants impact. But a lot of the data that we get about those grants comes in narrative form, in text. So it's not necessarily easy to extract it and build a good data set that shows exactly where those dollars are at work. So we are doing some work internally to make our public data be more granular in places where it makes sense, because that's important for us and also important for everyone who studies and thinks about transportation to be able to help build more equitable solutions. It's also important to remember that transportation data is not just geospatial, tempting as it is to think of it that way. Our work impacts people, and people can be really geographically distributed. So think about groups like low-income single moms who live in the suburbs, for example. Some of them might be neighbors, but a lot of them are probably pretty dispersed. People with disabilities is another example, or older adults. Again, you might see some particular communities where those folks gather, but there are also a lot of them just distributed across every part of this country. So disaggregating demographic and other data is a way that we can better learn how to serve these groups as well. One big example of how we do demographic data within DOT is our National Household Transportation Survey, which is currently collecting data for a new release. And then we also work quite a bit with data from the US Census as well. I also want to touch really quickly for a second on LGBTQ people's data, because when it comes to transportation, environment, and a lot of issues that are not really seen as core health and human services issues, there's not a whole lot of data on LGBTQ people out there. So in the coming years, I hope that that's somewhere where that we can grow, because we really need this data to be able to design programs and services. And then at the same time as we're collecting this data, we have to think really carefully about what data we're going to release and how we're going to release it, because it can be really easy sometimes to compromise the safety and privacy of people. As an example of that, think about a bus stop where many transgender and non-binary people might be getting on the bus because they all live close by. If one of DOT's data sets surfaces that information, even if that data set is aggregated and even if no individuals are identified, we're still potentially exposing those people to additional levels of risk. So we have to think carefully about how data can be used, and just be really mindful and take the time to do it right.
Jay, let me just build on that point before we go to Meredith. In 2013, when I was at USAID, we hosted, along with Freedom House, a meeting on physical security and cybersecurity of human rights defenders. And I still remember a South African activist from the LGBTQ community saying, you know, it's one thing, I work in this office and the office is fine, but then I have this incredibly long commute home where you focused on the physical security and the cybersecurity of the office, but then I have a life outside and there's nothing there for me. And so your point is well taken, and I've heard it around the world. And so it's important to recognize in this country, and also just everything that you talked about, it's important to recognize how much of a paradigm shift this is from how the United States, the government has talked about and thought about transportation dating back to the 50s and 60s, and the impact that it has had on communities, particularly communities of color, that this is really a moment to discuss that and unravel that. So we'll come back to you, Jay, on that.
Yeah.
Meredith.
Can I add one super quick thing on that?
Absolutely.
There's a new grant program that DOT is launching called Reconnecting Communities, which takes a look at removing highways or altering highways that have divided communities historically. So that program is taking grant proposals right now. If that's something that interests you, highly recommend you take a look.
Yes, and Jay, I'm going to, if you're willing, connect you with a young author who is working on a book on all of this, and who just recently wrote an article in the New York Times about Washington, D.C. and the Anacostia Bridge, and turning that into a space that is used by the community, and how local stakeholders engage. Her name is Megan Kimball, and so I'll be connecting you shortly.
Yes, please do. I would love that.
Meredith.
Yes. Well, as Jay mentioned about the Reconnecting program, I also would love to speak to that, you know, maybe a little bit later, because our office is actively working with the folks implementing the Reconnecting program to make sure that they're actually accessing the communities that they need. But kind of back to just disaggregated data on a whole and everything that Jay was touching on, you know, we don't want to just be a government that sets policy and then gives it to people. We want to bring them in and have this inclusive engagement of, you know, what do you need? Not just here are resources for you to go use. And as part of that, we need to know where the people are and who the people are specifically. So right now, you know, we have this data at a very aggregate level, at state levels, at county levels that Jay was speaking about. And so we need to drill down and know, you know, where are the people that would benefit most from these programs? And how can we get resources to them? As Jay said, they're often very dispersed, but also sometimes they're not. They're in specific communities. And so who are the stakeholders? Who are the leaders of these communities? This all ties into disaggregated data. Even within the categories that you mentioned of, you know, race, ethnicity, gender, you know, when you offer somebody race categories, you know, they might not see themselves represented there. So it's offering a space for, you know, a lot of forms have multiracial, and it's, you know, what does that mean to you? Or if I select Hispanic, you know, it is different to be from different parts of the Hispanic community. So it's providing space for people to really self-identify. And I think that's something that we're trying to infuse within the policy of, you know, what do you need? And let that inform the policy instead of just giving people the funds.
So this idea of what is needed and where are the people is, again, a paradigm shift. This should be the gold standard in our work in global development, whether it's overseas or at home. And you'd be surprised at how often it doesn't happen. So, to get this all institutionalized, obviously the executive order is really helping, but tying it to these various laws is, I think, really critical. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. The working group released its first report this spring. What were some of the main findings and what was surprising? Who wants to start?
Well, I can start. I would say the first priority was to make disaggregated data the norm, was to follow through on this paradigm shift. But as Jay mentioned, we also need to do this with a focus on privacy. We can't just go around saying, I want to know everything about you as an individual, and then I want to make this data available to the entire federal government. There are obviously privacy concerns that people are going to have. And so we want to do this cautiously and with care towards the individuals that we're asking, because as Jay mentioned, we don't want to also overburden these communities that have been historically underrepresented in data by now going back to them and saying, great, we want to catch up on 50 years of underrepresenting you. Please fill out all of this information that may not now be secure. So I think that's probably the biggest priority to me. Jay, what would you say?
I was going to say that too. So one of my side projects as a PIF is working with the National Artificial Intelligence Institute at the Veterans Administration on some research around privacy and data sharing for artificial intelligence. So AI is obviously growing really quickly. There's a lot of amazing developments in the medical space. We want veterans to benefit from all that. In order for that to happen, we need veterans' data to be part of how AI is trained and how it's developed. At the same time, veterans make up 7% of the US population. And there are a lot of data sets that are really specific to veterans. So one of the things that a lot of us have been talking about lately is the risk of re-identification. And for anyone who might not know what I mean by that, imagine you have a couple different data sets with different variables about the same people, and you join those two data sets together. From those different variables, you often can identify particular individuals from within that data and know exactly who they are. So it puts the security of veterans at risk and puts their privacy at risk potentially if we don't share the data in the right way. We need a lot more research into privacy enhancing technologies and a lot more uptake of them in government. And also a lot more research really specifically on the equity impacts of privacy enhancing tech.
So this is, everything you're talking about is pretty new, right? And I've been involved in interagency processes where, the White House on high says do X, and there are lots of ways in which the federal government can respond, agencies can respond. They can slow roll, they can want to be leaders, obviously having some political appointees in various agencies to help nudge things along. But how would you talk about the interagency response to this? Meredith, maybe we start with you since you seem to be in the thick of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think this ties back into one of the other recommendations that came out of the working group, which was to use existing federal infrastructure for data sharing between agencies, and not only data sharing, but to use underutilized data sets so that we're, again, not going back to the same people and asking them for the same data again. And so I think when we come at it from that lens of, we want to use what you already have. We don't want to give you more administrative burden. We're not asking you to go out and collect anything more, but we're actually wanting to use what you already have just in a new format to, do an equity assessment of where historically funding has gone, where transportation exists, those sorts of things. I think agencies are very receptive to that. When folks come in and sort of dictate the data that needs to be collected and how it needs to be done, I think that's where pushback rises up.
That's a really key lesson in how ideas become policy. Dictating is not a good way to get interagency buy-in. Jay, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, speaking from the agency perspective, I feel like there has been a lot of really great enthusiasm for this initiative. And I think something that's really important to remember is while a lot of this might be driven by political factors and by the administration, There's also a lot of really phenomenal career civil servants who have been with agencies like DOT for years. And a lot of these civil servants have been thinking about equity for years. So when an initiative like this gets created by the political powers that be, in the moment, it can really create a lot of momentum and create really great opportunities for projects and ideas that civil servants have already been thinking of to get started and to get completed and make it over the finish line. And it also creates a great environment for collaborating and learning together, which is really important for federal agencies because we're all dealing with a lot of similar challenges. DOT is not the only agency trying to disaggregate our geospatial data, for example, so we can all learn from each other's approaches.
And thank you for pointing out the role of these civil servants who have a lot of experience, ideas. It's not as if the political appointees come in with all the good ideas. Although I will say at DOT, I think we need to also acknowledge that Secretary Fox, who was the DOT secretary under President Obama, also had very much an equity lens, and as a former mayor was also had hands-on experience of how all of this played out. So it's not as if, at least at DOT, it was beginning from zero. So I think that's important.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the external. Oh, Jay, did you want to add something?
I was just going to quickly say that Secretary Fox is a phenomenal leader and one of my personal favorites from Obama's cabinet. You definitely still see his footprint everywhere around DOT.
We were lucky at Heinz College to have him affiliated with us. So yes, I hear you on this. We've talked about the burden of data collection in work that I've been doing along with a team from Heinz since 2020. There's been missing disaggregated data, right? And we've looked at Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Toronto, but also in collaboration with colleagues in LA. And oftentimes what we see is that the local government is expecting the nonprofits to collect data, and the nonprofits don't necessarily have either the expertise, the time, the funding. If you've ever worked for a nonprofit, you know a lot of your time is spent fundraising. And frankly, you know, local philanthropy or any national philanthropy is not necessarily an open spigot for data collection. I mean, maybe that will happen going forward when people realize the importance and connection of disaggregated data with trying to right wrongs and deal with equity issues. But clearly in the report, external engagement was an important aspect to how this all came together. Can either of you speak to the external engagement piece?
I can jump in on this one. So this is an area where DOT has been doing a whole lot of work. And we also have a recognition that we need to keep growing in this area and engaging more fully with communities. I also really want to stress that we're not doing engagement just for the sake of doing engagement, but rather to take what we learn and use it so that we're not going back to the same communities over and over again to ask the same questions. So within our data work, there's a couple of key ways that we've been getting information on what we should build and how we should think about it. One of those is a request for information that we put in the Federal Register in 2021. Let me take a second and explain what I'm talking about here. So for those who might not know, the Federal Register is a publication that's meant to increase transparency of the federal government. And it's a place where different documents are published for people to know what's happening in government and also be able to give comment and to give feedback. So for example, the president and the administration put a lot of information in there. When a federal agency makes a new rule, they put that rule on the Federal Register and typically open it up for a comment period. Request for information is a particular type of document that you put on the Federal Register where you can ask people questions that you want to know as an agency and just take responses to that. So the request for information, or the RFI that we did in 2021, was geared towards people who are using our data related to equity. And it was designed to help us better learn from our users what tools they needed and to explore what key questions people really wanted to answer related to equity and transportation. So we got several hundred responses from academics and researchers, from state and local agencies working on transportation, a whole range of nonprofits, some for-profit, and then some public comments as well from just citizens. Not just citizens, let me revise that, from citizens. We're also exploring supplementing that RFI with a little bit of user research around data usage this fall. And that's to fill in some areas where we didn't get as much response from a particular community or particular type of organization as we wanted to see in the RFI. And then I've also got colleagues who have held numerous listening sessions and feedback sessions where that data gets brought back into DOT. So all of this information feeds into planning and memos and our processes of thinking about what to focus on and how to shape our work. Also want to just highlight really quickly that Secretary Buttigieg is constantly on the road and that there has been a lot of effort at the agency level. So not just focused on data, but focused on all of agency to really learn how we can work better with communities. So he's been in a number of town halls, he's been in a number of conversations and has traveled quite a bit, and so have other departmental leaders. So we expect to keep doing this as long as there's more we need to learn.
Another example of a mayor then going on to be Secretary of Transportation and having that real life experience. And just to say, as somebody who has submitted comment to the Federal Register, in this case, the Department of Defense was looking at requiring contractors for DoD to have training in being able to recognize and combat human trafficking. It is amazing the power of the ability to comment and how that can actually shape what happens next. I did it with at the time a pro bono attorney, and we were up against a lot of big DoD contractors. It was very much a David and Goliath situation. They thought somehow that we were much more powerful than we were. We were two citizens writing in and had an impact. Meredith, did you want to say something, or should I go to a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to Jay's point, that my boss, the chief data scientist of the US, actually just put out an RFI on the Federal Register on September 2nd that is still open for comment because it's open for 30 days about how the federal government can galvanize diverse partnerships with research organizations, other levels of government, and produce better equitable data for use. So if anyone is interested, you can still comment on that, I believe, until the end of the month.
Meredith, if you have a link that you could put in the chat, that would be fantastic.
Yes.
And then we will all get busy writing. Part of the problem here is obviously that if you're not checking the register, you're not seeing things. So it's hard. And this really gets to something I think you brought up. Oftentimes there are programs that are available, but people don't know how to access them. And so a lot of money goes undistributed to communities and individuals who really need it. I'm going to recognize Mariama right now to ask a question. Do you want to unmute, maybe turn your camera on? There you go.
Here I am. Hi, Jay and Meredith, thank you for joining us. My question is specifically for Jay. You mentioned an initiative at DOT that's looking to reconnect communities that have been separated by these highways. I am from one of those communities in Parkchester, the Bronx, that was separated by the Cross Bronx Highway. Shout out to Robert Moses. But I'm wondering if, as part of the criteria that you're using to evaluate the proposals that come in, I know it's still in the proposal accepting phase, if there's anything looking towards how to minimize disruption of businesses and things that are along those highways. I was listening to a podcast, I can't remember from what neighborhood they were talking about, but it was talking about how when the highway was built, it really did disturb a lot of the businesses that were along the street that got turned into a highway. And now, even though they're looking to reconnect the community, all of that construction is going to still be disturbing those communities, the houses and the shops along those streets. So I'm wondering if there's any consideration of that as part of the equity evaluation.
Yeah, so effective construction are something that we're trying to think about across all of DOT's work. It's definitely one of those big things that falls under burdens, like we've talked about. I'm actually not super involved with the Reconnecting Communities grant process. I'm not involved in evaluating proposals, but I do know that we've been working across the board to really make sure that there's community input about grant projects that get proposed to DOT. And in a lot of cases, there'll also be a nonprofit or a foundation or some other organization that's closer to community members that will help to translate what the community needs. So it's an area where we have some space to grow, and also an area where we're putting a lot of work and focus. It's very important.
It really points to the role of community development foundations play. And Pittsburgh is particularly blessed with not only lots of local philanthropy, but a really great local community development. Meredith, did you want to say anything before I go to a few more questions from the audience?
Yeah, I was just going to say to that question. So I've actually been working on the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. And as part of our work, we've been doing an equity assessment of webinars that the program has been hosting for community members to ask those specific questions of, how is this going to impact my community? If we do get the grant, how do I apply? And those sorts of things. And so the grant opportunity is actually open for proposals until October 13th. And so we took the webinar data, which represented people that registered, people that actually attended, the sorts of organizations they represented, and then actually their zip code where they are. And we were able to map that with equity layers of, who is the most transportation disadvantaged, or what is the poverty level of this area. And we're actually able to give recommendations to DOT on specific areas where they were lacking in webinar participation, or specific areas where they had good participation, but should really consider them because of those equity levels. So that's like one way that we're trying to use these equity assessments to actually impact the implementation of the policy.
You want people actually showing up, and you want to make sure that you're getting people in the room. Jake, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. And by the way, if I'm looking this way, it's because I'm on two monitors, and you're on the other screen. So anyway, thank you so much, Jay and Meredith, for speaking. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm definitely going to rewatch it because there's some stuff I missed. If I missed this part, I'm very sorry, but it's a question that I've been very interested in. It's about bringing in people into government who might not have, who are from underrepresented backgrounds and who might not have the data skills, us from Carnegie Mellon, who, are privileged to, gain a lot of coding and other statistics skills. We are very fit to go to government work. I'm curious how you think the government works on getting people from more underrepresented backgrounds, maybe people who don't have necessarily tech backgrounds like a CMU or other big schools. I'm curious how you think the government goes about that, and what programs there are to do that, and if you think there needs to be work on that, or what progress has there been already with recruiting people from here.
Jake, it's a great question. We hadn't yet addressed it. It is a topic of great interest, certainly at CMU, but I think a lot of universities in general are thinking about this. At what point and how do you engage schools? How young do you go? We're constantly thinking about this at Heinz in terms of the master's program, but I think there's a lot of belief out there in higher education that you need to start much, much earlier than even college. But Jay or Meredith, how is this a part of the conversation? What are the strategies?
Absolutely. Well, I will say within my office, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we have an equity action plan. And one of the key tenets of that is inclusive engagement. And so part of that is listening to the community and hosting roundtables and bringing in scholars, as you mentioned, from underrepresented backgrounds. And so we've actually hosted 5 roundtables on a specific series called The Time Is Now. And it's about equity in STEM education and how do we bring in underrepresented folks to STEM education and actually start that process earlier. And then my program as well, the U.S. Digital Corps, it's to bring historically underrepresented groups that are early in their career as technologists into the federal government. So those are kind of 2 ways that I hope answers your question.
We actually have a Heinz alum in this first cohort. Do you have any?
So, yes.
Do you have any tips for folks applying? And I would throw this to you as well, Jay, for the Presidential Innovation Fellow. Is there any advice that you can give?
That's a great question. I think to just be authentic. The program is looking for you to have experiences that show your ability, not necessarily for you to have a prescribed path or anything. So I think just being able to speak to the different qualifications for the different tracks that you can apply for. And then the kind of application process involves, some technical assessments and interviews. And so I think just showing the skills that you've learned in your graduate degree or undergraduate degree or previous work experience would be great.
Is there an essay?
There's not an essay.
Is there an interview?
Yes. So the process is, a resume review and then kind of take home technical assessment that specializes to your track, and then a technical interview on the phone with somebody, and then you potentially interview with agencies to be placed at.
Can I just ask one more question? And what are the different tracks?
Yeah, that is a great question. So there is data science, software engineering, product management, design, and cybersecurity.
Got it. Jay?
We have similar tracks as well, but I don't think we have a cybersecurity track in the PIF program at this time. When it comes to bringing more people of diverse backgrounds into government, there's a lot we got to do. I think we have made some good progress. I feel like I see really good progress, in particular around the Technology Transformation Service, the GSA, which is the part of the U.S. General Services Administration that houses the PIF program, USDC, an agency called 18F, which provides consulting to other government agencies, and several other services and teams as well. So similar to a lot of technology companies, TTS has a lot of guilds and a lot of groups that come together and come up with ideas. There's also been a really thorough internal DEIA process, and there's a lot of thinking that's surfaced through these mechanisms about how to really create spaces where someone who's got great skills can come and show that and be seen and recognized. I also want to note that there are fellow PIFs in the program right now who don't have an undergraduate degree. One of the things that's been a conversation around TTS is what skills do we actually need someone to have, and what qualifications do we actually need for this job? And that's led to some interesting conversations too about how we ask people questions in interviews and what we expect of someone in an interview, because someone who's a PIF doesn't necessarily need to have press secretary level answer in the moment kind of communication skills, right? It's typically not our job. So we try to gear interviews to be designed for the role that the person's actually going to be in. And then all of the current presidential innovation fellows are also a part of the interview process. So
that's a great point. It's amazing to me how many times you see the opposite of, particularly, I would say, unfortunately, in some leadership positions in government where somebody is put into a position, they don't actually necessarily have the skills to be doing the job. And that can result in all sorts of chaos. So your point, it sounds like whoever's running PIF has got some very good ideas. So thanks, Jake. And I'm going to go to Shannon right now.
Hi. Sorry, I'm in Taipei right now, so a little far away.
Oh my goodness.
One of the things I feel like I'm really passionate about is data accessibility and data inclusivity. I feel like we often have our own jargon, and it's so important to communicate that to these communities. Like, we're taking their data to help them, but like, do they understand what it's being used for? Or like, I guess trying to figure out like how you guys handle that aspect of policy. It's like making sure that people understand your intent, what the outcome is. And like, so I'm not really sure if that is a big part of both of your jobs, like if you're actually communicating with the people that you're helping, because like that always, I recognize that policy has many parts, but like, do you see perhaps in your fellowships a role for that type of role for someone that's applying at all?
Great question.
Yes. I'm excited about this one, so I hope you don't mind if I jump on it. So bringing human-centered design concepts into data is one of my big passions. And that's one of the things that's driving us to do more user research at DOT. So this first round of user research, we're really talking with data users and not with the people in the data. But I also think it's really important for us to actually talk to the people in the data and think about the way that we shape the data to have it match the community. So rather than us teaching the community how the data works, we should have the communities show us how their reality works. And then we do our best to reflect that in the data that we create. I think one thing that's a really good tool for that we have at TTS is a plain language policy. So everyone who joins the Technology Transformation Service goes through a training during your first 60 days about using plain language in government documents. I think we can apply the same kind of thinking to data. If someone looks at this data and doesn't know what it says, we need to fix the data. We don't need to go educate people, right? So you can definitely work on those kind of projects within both PIF and USDC and a number of other places in the government. Please come. We need it.
There's a number of us who work on the Sustainable Development Goals that are very, very passionate about the need for human-centered design. We think that this is greatly needed, and I'm thinking in particular of my colleagues at the World Justice Project who have identified worldwide justice gaps on a range of social justice issues and are really calling for, during the World Justice Forum that happened in The Hague in late May and early June, where we had a Heinz team go, the need for human-centered design. So it's really great to hear about that. Meredith?
Yeah, Shannon, I would definitely turn your attention as well to a new initiative called, or maybe not new, but community navigator programs. These are programs that take funding from agencies and actually give them to local organizations to then go to, the local government or go to local entrepreneurs and actually kind of almost act as a translator of like, what does this government thing saying and what do you actually need? And by, sort of having that intermediary, it increases the trust of the person that's actually applying for this thing. It makes sense to them, but it also, allows them to access the things that they actually need and increases the diversity of applicants that we're getting. So it's kind of a win-win across the board. But yeah, community navigators are a great thing that we're hoping to increase.
That is really interesting. Is there a link or is there any information that we can find about that? Because that sounds like a program that really needs to be elevated.
Absolutely. So it's part of the American Rescue Plan, which was the ARP, was a COVID relief plan. But I can definitely send a link through I think it's currently housed at the Small Business Administration, but can absolutely send a link.
We're going to go to Kristen, and then I have a question in the chat. Go, Kristen.
Great. Thank you both so much. I've been really excited by the conversation and the intentionality you both have shown around data privacy and really thinking about like what you are collecting. I worked with a group of students on a project called Just Recovery this summer, looking at COVID funds and the use of them in different cities and how that recovery funding was impacting communities. And I think something that we saw is that, like was mentioned earlier, a lot of nonprofits were responsible for collecting data. And I know that one of the food banks we talked to was saying, we would really love to collect some more demographic data on who's using our services, but even asking those questions is a barrier to services. And we never want that to be the case. So I was curious if you guys could expand on and talk a little bit more about how do you make determinations on what level of granularity of data that you really need so that you're not over collecting and overburdening? And then how do you actually, especially if there are privacy concerns or real harm that could come out of data that's being collected if it were to be shared widely, what are some best practices for making sure that data is secure and also communicating that to the people whose data is being utilized?
Great question.
Jay, I'm going to let you tackle that one.
Okay. Exciting. I have 50 different things I want to say about this, but I'll try to limit it to
no, go for it. Go for it.
We can do right now. So when it comes to collecting people's data, I think it's really important to, again, engage with communities. So if we can do user research or do other ways of finding out what people are comfortable with, I think that's a really important part of the process that often gets overlooked. I think you can also learn a lot of the same things by just seeing whether or not people respond. Making demographic data voluntary is great. having it be something that you ask after someone receives a service is something to think about. In a lot of contexts, that makes sense. I think the other thing that's a real challenge is that a lot of individual people don't really understand privacy, and that privacy is evolving really, really quickly as technology evolves. I'm going to go back to what I was saying about TTS's plain language training and say plain language privacy statements and plain language privacy policies, and put the information about privacy where the user is providing their data. Don't make them 100 dig for it. Say right up front, here's what this will be used for. I think with cases where there's really sensitive data involved, so for example, medical data is something to think pretty heavily about. I think we need to be more upfront about the ways that we're using data and give people more ways to opt in or opt out of being a part of those efforts. But it's really context specific, and I think it's also really locally specific, right? People in one city might have completely different feelings about giving information to their food bank, and that might have a history that we don't know at the federal level or at the state level even. So I think being really careful with one size fits all standards and giving local communities and states and other places a place in shaping the decisions we make is really important.
This just brings up to me the idea that we need different kinds of regulation of these tech companies that there's no, how many of us read the privacy statements closely? They talk about a need for plain language. Meredith, did you want to add anything, or should I go to the question from Brooke?
We can go to Brooke's question. I think Jay hit it on the head.
So Brooke's asking, what resources would you recommend for those of us wanting to learn more about civic tech and find more information about organizations doing this type of work?
One thing that I'm aware of that a lot of major cities have is a civic tech happy hour. And those are often organized by people who are local. Go to your local civic tech happy hour. It might feel weird busting in on this thing, but I can promise there are lots of people there who are also thinking about jobs and looking for opportunities. It's not just people who are already working in government. And it's a great place to learn what the day-to-day job is like.
It would be really weird if there wasn't a civic tech happy hour in Pittsburgh. Are there in DC?
DC definitely has them, and we have a number of different meetups too that are usually functionally focused. So for example, if you want to find a GIS meetup or a natural language processing meetup, there's a whole bunch of people in town doing that kind of work who come together and share the work that they're doing and also talk about job opportunities. I know a number of other cities have similar things. I don't know about Pittsburgh, unfortunately. I'm sorry, I'm not prepared for that.
Yeah, I would say as well, there is a program called Coding It Forward that is an opportunity for folks to get involved in civic tech within a summer internship, and they have a wonderful newsletter that always sends out different opportunities. I would also say that the civic tech community is very active on Twitter. There are always people posting different opportunities, just other folks to follow and to see how their work is going. So I'd say if you're not kind of on the Twitter web, I'd maybe get on there.
Is there a particular Twitter handle? I mean, am I looking at Civic Tech, or what am I looking for?
Yeah, I normally start with like a single organization that I'm interested in. So maybe that's the Digital Corps, maybe that's the Presidential Innovation Fellows, and then just sort of see like what they're posting and who they're uplifting, and then sort of go from there into that. Bye.
That's great advice. That's certainly how I use Twitter, either on Russia-related stuff or SDG-related stuff, and I get a lot of information. I see Andrew's hand up.
I was just sort of interested, we've talked a lot about equity and data and sort of using that data to create equitable programs. I was wondering if your guys' task force has looked into sort of around internships in the federal government and potentially the impact that the unpaid internship system in the federal government has on equity and generally in Washington even for equity to be any bit represented in this city because of the fact that it's so expensive to live here and people are having to pay to work here, especially as young professionals. So I was wondering if your group is looking at all about that, and if the Biden administration with this executive order to push towards equity has tried to work towards making all federal internships, including White House internships, paid.
Comments? Jay, Meredith?
I'm looking at Meredith a little bit because I think you know more about White House internships and such.
Yes. So as of this summer, all White House internships are now paid. There are no more unpaid internships at the White House. I know that the State Department also just transitioned to having only paid internships. I do think this is part of agencies' DEIA efforts that if you want to be more inclusive, you cannot have a financial barrier to getting in the door. And so I definitely hear you. I'm not sure if the administration has put out, actual recommendations on this, but at least is taking limited steps that they can to at least increase that in government.
Thanks. And just to tag onto that for DOT, I don't actually know where we're currently at, but I do know that we're going through a really large assessment of our workplace when it comes to equity. So I'm sure this is something that they're thinking about, along with a range of other workforce related issues. Also, a lot of nonprofits, both in DC and also across the country. I know DC better because that's where home is for me. A lot of nonprofits have gotten rid of unpaid internships as well. That's been a really big conversation in that sector over the past couple of years. Speaking for myself personally, I couldn't agree more. Paying interns is essential if we want everyone to have a chance to get a foot in the door.
I have two questions before I open it up for more. There's oftentimes data lags, right? And so a lot of the work that the working group is focused on, I believe, is going to really come into impact in FY23. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that about the right timeline? I mean, when would we begin to see more data available?
For DOT, I think it might be a little bit past fiscal year 2023 for a lot of things. So working in it day in and day out, I'm seeing changes every single day, but it takes a lot of incremental changes to make some of these things happen. So one thing that's a really big challenge for DOT is we don't own any of our nation's transportation infrastructure. Well, except for a 1 mile stretch of road in Virginia that's used as a test track. That is the only road the DOT owns. State and local agencies are the owners of your local highways and your local transit system. So when a big chunk of DOT's budget is grants that we give to state and local agencies to make upgrades to that transportation. So that model of ownership is great, but one thing that it makes really hard for us is we don't have an easy way to just get the data about these systems. We're not like NOAA, for example, where NOAA owns a whole bunch of satellites and they can just get the data from their satellites. We don't have that. So when we're gonna get data, when we're trying to build a national data set, we have to get all of the groups that would be contributing to that, whether that's state and local transportation agencies or other players, to agree to do it. We've got to get standards in place that everyone's comfortable with and can work with. We've got to think about how to build a system to aggregate all that data. And then we've got to get the gears moving and get it running. And then we've got to QA it and QC it. It's a whole lot of steps. So we're doing a lot of exciting things, and there's a really great opportunity here with disaggregated data. It's also something that takes a lot of time. So I do think it will be a few years until we see a lot of changes that are public facing, but the work behind the scenes is happening every single day. People are grinding on it and digging in, and we are super, super excited to be moving it forward.
Meredith, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just, up arrow everything that Jay said. I think that it's going to take time and compounding impacts of, actually getting communities that have been underserved resources, and then being able to hopefully see the impacts years down the line, if not, decades down the line. So as he said, the work is happening every day, but it'll take time to tell.
Can I ask one, we don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to ask about the Infrastructure Act, Meredith, and what it is that you're doing actually with this. How does that relate to all of what we've been discussing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the infrastructure law that was passed last November is $1.2 trillion. It's a once in a generation investment in our country's infrastructure. But with that, about half of it is grants. So these are things that you have to apply for, whereas the other half are just formula going to be given to states based off of, their percentages of people, or how they qualify for certain programs. But for grants, this is really going down to what communities are applying for them. And as you think about it, if you are from DC or New York City or Houston, you're a large city that most likely has an office that is in charge of applying for, writing grants, finding the opportunities to even apply for. But if you are a small town mayor or official, you're probably running your town day to day and don't necessarily have the staff that is also going to find these opportunities for you. So it's a lot of making sure that folks know that this funding is available for them and giving them the resources to do just that, to actually apply for it and actually receive it, and then have the staff to implement it. A lot of this goes hand in hand with the American Rescue Plan, now the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it's making sure that these funds are actually getting out the door into the communities that need them most, and not just the people that are most able to apply for them.
I hear you on that. Jay, anything to add on that?
No, I'm going to go with, she nailed it.
So here we have 2 minutes left. A question about international students who wish to see their career at the intersection of public policy and data science in the US. What would be the best approach? And I'm going to shortcut it and say the federal government doesn't hire international students. So if you're looking at that intersection, you're probably looking at nonprofits. But there's lots of opportunity, I would say, nonprofits, assuming that there are visa issues that can be handled. But I don't know if Meredith or Jay have anything to add to that. Can I ask when, so the working group continues its work, correct? And does it meet like monthly, or, I mean, what's the tempo?
Yeah, so from the working group came several sort of subcommittees that were chartered. So one of them is the committee that I sit on, just the subcommittee for equitable data. And so those are continuing to be sort of stood up as an outcome of these recommendations from the spring. So those working groups are, coming out of them are continuing their work, whereas the overhead working group doesn't meet all that often.
Got it. Well, listen, we are so grateful to OSTP, to the Department of Transportation for sending you to us, and thank you notes will be forthcoming. It has been really uplifting, and again, in gloomy times, the both of you are such shining examples of good policy leading to good people and good work. So we're really, really appreciative of your time and your expertise. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having us. And please, everybody, consider a career in civic tech, or what's the phrase you use? And
public interest technology.
Yeah. Come join us. We want you.
Excellent.
Absolutely. And feel free to reach out with any questions about digital core or anything.
Thank you so much. Have a safe rest of your day. Bye now.